So this video is going to be my gift to you, dear viewer, for sitting through that entire 3 hour long frustrating discussion between Tony from One Dime, myself, and Reed Kane. I'm just going to summarize here in a few minutes instead of 3 hours the Marxist response to some of Tony's specific points, but also his overall argument, which I think we can summarize as Marxists need to take accountability for Bolshevism. So I'm just going to read off my notes from here. The problem with this fixation on modes of government and regime type is that it's undialectical. You're going to hear me say this a lot. The point of socialist revolution is not to set up a specific type of regime with a specific set of checks and balances and democratic structures. What is correct in one period ceases to be correct in another. This is the essence of revolutionary theory. The job of any revolutionary leadership is to be able to know when to change tactics, strategies, and organizational forms as conditions change and evolve. The Bolshevik regime was not totalitarian either until deeper into Stalin's ascent. Tony defines totalitarianism as total control over civil society. The Soviet Union was repressive in certain contexts, absolutely, and rightfully so. But the early Soviet Union was famously full of heated debate, open disagreement, and compromise. And compared to the Tsarist regime, Russian civil social life was bursting with art, science, culture, pluralism, and solidarity. This notion that early Bolshevism was characterized by uniformity and top-down dictates on everything is asinine and ahistorical, a total fantasy. Tony claims that our only excuse for the totalitarian degeneration was the failure of the German Revolution. He thinks this is a weak argument. He insists that the Bolsheviks should have had a better and more democratic plan to govern at home. Why didn't they just think about governing? First of all, they actually did have ideas on how to govern, which they studied. But as I said in the discussion, the degeneration wasn't just because of the failure of Germany. That was the biggest part of it. But it was also because of the bureaucratization internal to Russia, largely as a result of the Civil War and subsequent invasion by 21 imperialist armies, which both decimated the working class, the most advanced of which were on the front lines and died in the greatest numbers, then having to increasingly rely on middle-class experts and czarist bureaucrats to fill the various positions central to governance, which the illiterate masses were not equipped to fill, and then being stuck with no option but to pay them better than the rest of the workers, thus creating a layer of privileged bureaucrats, whose politics of defending said privileges were inevitably expressed through Stalin. This was what conditioned, not determined, conditioned the rise of Tony's totalitarianism, not some ideas or lack of ideas the Bolsheviks had about how to govern. How they governed was nothing more than that which appeared to be required of them to defend the revolution in the moment. Another theme was democratic centralism, which means internal debate and democracy, but once the decision's been made, external unity and obedience to the decisions. So democratic centralism is for the party, not for the administration of socialism. And frankly, the party is necessary until the socialist revolution is complete. As we know, it was never completed. In the discussion, Tony was skeptical when I brought up that fascism would have been the potential alternative to Bolshevism. A quote from Trotsky here: "Had the Bolsheviks not seized power, the world would have had a Russian name for fascism 5 years before the March of Rome." So fascism was a real potential in Russia at the time. First of all, the Russian right was extremely anti-Semitic. Famously, the pogroms and the fake Protocols of the Elders of Zion document came out of the regime that the Bolsheviks were struggling against. Russia was quite literally the epicenter of European anti-Semitism. It was the Disneyland of Jew hate. The Black Hundreds were a collective of Russian ultranationalist, anti-Semitic, xenophobic, monarchist goons enlisted by the police to carry out the dirty work of attacks on socialists directly. Biographer Semyon Lubash described the Black Hundreds as, quote, "the movement we can now call Russian fascism, which is decades older than the European one." This is from 1925. These thugs were closely aligned with General Kornilov and were poised to occupy positions of power had the rebellion succeeded. Among Kornilov's most prominent backers, the Bourgeois Cadet Party, officially opened their ranks to the Black Hundreds. While the movement did not at all match the scale of Italian fascists, it was certainly an expression of proto-fascism in waiting. Speaking of Italian fascism, I'll just take a moment to clarify a common misreading of Mussolini when he said, quote, "Fascism should more appropriately be called corporatism because it's a merger of corporate and state power." Mussolini was not here referring to private corporations with shareholders as we understand them. Corporatism here refers to an alleged alternative form of social organization to laissez-faire capitalism on one hand, as practiced by the United States and Britain, or state socialism as practiced by the USSR. A third way, if you will, or a third position. The idea was to envision society as analogous to a human body, literally the corpus, hence corporatism, with different sectors being analogies to various organs of everything, and then the state being the brain controlling the whole operation. The organs, say agriculture sector, military, business, trade unions, etc., would each operate as a class collaborationist sections wherein the unions and the business leaders would coordinate their activities in service to the greater fascist state. Hence the maxim, quote, everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. Much of what I just read was from a solid summary from Redditor Play MP1. On the Bolshevik election loss in dissolving the Constituent Assembly, the October Revolution essentially happened because the masses were not satisfied with the provisional government. It had not given them peace, land, or bread. So the Bolsheviks offered a platform of exactly those things and of creating a federal government in exclusively Soviets, which were a more advanced form of social organization. Quoting now from In Defense of October by John Rees. The Soviet is a superior form of democracy because it unifies political and economic power, unlike Parliament, which leaves the most important powers of the bourgeoisie, its economic strength, untouched, because it brings under democratic control the administrative and legislative functions of government. Unlike Parliament, which leaves the civil service, army, and police in unelected hands. And most of all, because the Soviet is an organ of struggle responsive to the will of the workers and capable of directly organizing strikes, protests, and so on. This alone would justify closing the Constituent Assembly. But there's more. The October Revolution had an effect on other parties in Russia. Specifically, after October, the SRs split into the pro-Bolshevik left SRs and the anti-Bolshevik right SRs. Additionally, a small group broke off from the Mensheviks, calling themselves Menshevik internationalists, over the issue of working with the Bolsheviks. So then, the Constituent Assembly elections were held. However, in vast swaths of the country, the ballots did not distinguish between various splits that had emerged since October. Millions of votes were cast for the SRs, a party which had since split in two, with many voters wishing to vote for the pro-Bolshevik sect, but having their vote go towards the anti-Bolshevik sect. Now, the obvious solution to this would have been to hold another election, with the ballots listing all the parties to avoid this problem. And this is what the Bolsheviks initially proposed. However, the right SRs and other factions in the Constituent Assembly insisted on blocking it, planning instead to open and immediately dissolve the Bolshevik government. Actually, I'm lying. It was much worse than that. More from Rees. Quote, the Constituent Assembly was a rallying point for the right. The SRs planned what was effectively a counter-revolution to coincide with the opening of the Constituent Assembly. Everything was ready to transform the event into an insurrection. 30 armored cars were to advance against the Smolny, which was the Bolshevik headquarters. SR regiments would have supported this coup, quoting Radke here, the historian of the socialist revolutionaries. For weeks, the preparations had been made with this end in view. But by the new year, it was evident that a strictly military coup could not succeed. At the last moment, the SR leadership called off the rising. Nevertheless, the SR terrorist faction still made plans to kidnap Lenin and Trotsky on the 2nd of January 1918, 3 days before the assembly was due to open. 2 shots were fired at Lenin's car. And in southern Russia, the first white volunteer army under General Kaledin was already fighting Soviet power under the banner of the Constituent Assembly. Under these circumstances, it would have been absurd for the Bolsheviks to allow this invitation to counter-revolution to remain open. So the Bolsheviks chose to close the Constituent Assembly. Correctly, they decided that the proletariat was not going to be robbed of power because the bourgeoisie couldn't cobble together a fair election. So they dissolved it, and the All-Russian Congress of Soviets was created shortly after, on banning parties and the one-party state. Did you ever think to yourself, did the Bolsheviks maybe have legitimate reasons to kick out the other parties? Now, many of the bans were obviously valid, like the right SRs and the openly counter-revolutionary right-wing and bourgeois parties. But what about the left SRs? Well, the left SRs used their position in Soviet government to assassinate the German ambassador, thus trying to force a war with Germany, which the Congress of Soviets had rejected, and they arrested multiple government officials attempting a coup d'etat. In response to this provocation and treachery, the Bolsheviks had no choice but to outlaw the left SRs. When you actually take the time to learn the history, you discover that each decision was well considered in response to changing conditions. There never existed some nefarious hidden doctrine of one-party state among the Bolsheviks. This is baby brain thinking, dumb doo-doo head stuff. Another argument from Tony was that for Lenin, what was important was not democracy, but the class interests in charge. Well, I hate to break it to you, Tony, but that is socialism. That is the dictatorship of the proletariat. The entire point is to sublate democracy, to transcend its historical necessity by overcoming class itself. Democracy is not the point, it's not the ends, it is a means just like class war, suppression, and negotiation. None of the bourgeois revolutions were without repression or anti-democratic elements, but they launched society in a certain irreversible direction. Another thing that Tony mentioned a few times was that quote, the Bolsheviks had already consolidated power before the Americans sent any troops. I don't know why Tony thinks this is some kind of gotcha or revelation. The Civil War was already underway, and many of the other parties were actively working to undermine the revolution. Some moralistic commitment to the principle of democracy, in the way Tony advocates, would have totally destroyed the revolution before it even had a chance to get off the ground. And let's remember that dissolving the Constituent Assembly was, in fact, a way to preserve democracy in its higher form. I already talked in the discussion about why the Soviets became super diluted and just rubber stamps for the government itself. So I'll leave that part, but I'll finish with another one of Tony's main points here. Quote, I believe in judging ideas and political goals not just by their intentions, but by their effects. So we could play that same game with the bourgeois revolutions too. And at the risk of sounding like a broken Marxist, it's undialectical. Look at how the French revolutions brought the Reign of Terror, how the American Revolution brought the slow genocide of the American Indians, how the worldwide bourgeois revolution brought us fascism, the atom bomb, and 2 world wars. These revolutions sowed the seeds for capitalism itself, the very thing we are all struggling against and to overcome. Does this mean these revolutions were a mistake? Is our task today to hold accountable all the apologists for the bourgeois revolutions? Maybe we should have just stuck with medieval feudal society, because the subsequent regimes that emerged from the bourgeois revolutions were maybe not sufficiently democratic and often had totalitarian elements, or because the capitalism they brought about inevitably eroded civil society everywhere. You might counter that capitalism lifted billions out of extreme poverty, even though that was mostly China. And look at all the amazing shit we have now. Well, guess what? You can make the exact same arguments for the Soviet and Chinese revolutions, except they did it 10 times faster than any of the advanced imperialist powers. And if the last 200 years of history proves anything, it's that capitalist society can be just as oppressive and totalitarian as anything the Stalinists ever did. The Bolsheviks did not invent the Palantir, Oracle, total information awareness, dystopian nightmare where you get put on a list for criticizing the land of tiny hats that we're living today. Finally, I'd like to take a moment to psychoanalyze a very common condition I call Bolshevik derangement syndrome. The reflexive rejection of the Bolshevik-led revolution reflects a profound frustration with having to balance one's identity as a serious Marxist or leftist with the failure and degeneration of the left's highest ever achievement. So it's seen as an embarrassment, a regrettable mistake, an aberration. You're not going to make many friends in the DSA defending the record of the October Revolution. So to salvage Marxism and the idea of the left, myths have to be conjured up about the Bolshevik deviation from orthodox Marxism. It ended poorly, so it must not have been right from the outset. It's like a wound in the psyche that's too traumatic to confront. BDS sufferers are simultaneously longing to identify with the heroism of the Bolsheviks, while at the same time angry at them for frustrating their desire for an unimpeachable daddy that they can look to for guidance and assurance.